Scuba divers in Ontario can swim down the yellow center lines of a road that families drove on in 1957. Ontario has 13 real ghost towns frozen by fire, drowned by water, and erased by government decree. Here they are, starting at number 13. Number 13, Rokeby, Ontario. The stagecoaches stopped coming and the town just quietly ceased to exist. Rokeby sits along the Highway 511 corridor in Lanark County, a crossroads that once mattered enormously to the movement of people and goods through eastern Ontario. In its prime, it was the kind of place travelers depended on: a general store, timber outbuildings, and the social anchors of a rural community stitched together by the rhythms of horse-drawn travel. Then the roads got faster. Regional highways were widened and rerouted to move modern traffic at modern speeds, and those routes bypassed Rokeby entirely. There was no dramatic collapse, no fire, no flood. The commercial traffic simply redirected itself and never came back. What stands today along the quiet intersection of Greer Road is the original wooden Rokeby General Store, tilting slightly under the weight of decades, and a collection of timber outbuildings warping slowly back into the earth. The Anglican cemetery was officially classified by municipal records as fully abandoned, left now to the occasional care of heritage volunteers who come through when the season allows. A quiet end. But the next entry found out that the ground itself was the enemy all along. Number 12. Germania, Ontario. The government promised fertile farmland. What they delivered was solid rock. In 1870, the provincial government used the Free Grants and Homestead Act to lure hopeful German immigrants into the dense wilderness outside of Bracebridge in the Muskoka district. The brochures, in effect, described a land of agricultural promise. What the settlers found when they cleared the trees was a brutally thin layer of topsoil sitting on top of the Canadian Shield. Solid, unyielding granite that could not be broken by any plow they owned. They fought it for decades. The Germania schoolhouse was built. A community cemetery took shape. Log homesteads went up with the patient precision of people who still believed persistence would win. It did not. The rock was older than their ambitions, and it did not negotiate. After the First World War, the remaining families gave up and left. The schoolhouse still stands today along Germania Road, surrounded by dense secondary growth forest. The pioneer log homesteads are being split apart by root systems, their foundations consumed by the same landscape the settlers tried so hard to tame. Rokeby lost its traffic, Germania lost its soil. The next entry lost something far more explosive. Number 11, Eldorado, Ontario. In 1866, they found gold. By 1869, the dream was gone and people were furious enough to pick up weapons. In Hastings County along Highway 62 north of Madoc, became the epicenter of Ontario's first ever gold rush after a strike at the Richardson mine sent word spreading through the province like wildfire. The town boomed to over 80 buildings. Thousands of prospectors arrived. Hotels, saloons, and supply operations materialized almost overnight in the way that only resource fever can produce. The problem was geological. The deposit was a shallow pocket of high-grade ore, brilliant at the surface, worthless below it. Within 36 months, millions of dollars had evaporated, and the speculators who funded the operation were furious. In 1867, as rumors spread that the mine was either mismanaged or an outright fraud, a mob of over 100 armed miners stormed the Richardson mine property, demanding to inspect the shafts. Violence was narrowly averted only by the arrival of 25 armed police officers. That moment, frantic men with weapons surrounding a hole in the ground that had just taken everything they had, says everything about what resource fever does to ordinary people. Today, scattered wooden ruins and the shell of an early 1900s church remain along the highway. From financial ruin to something far more immediate, the next location had one afternoon to lose everything. Number 10, Milberta, Ontario. On October 4, 1922, Milberta ceased to exist before the sun went down. The Great Fire of 1922 was one of the deadliest wildfire disasters in Canadian history, burning across 18 townships and consuming 1,680 square kilometers of land in the Timiskaming district. Milberta, a resilient agricultural pioneer settlement that had been carved out of the Little Claybelt region since 1897, sat directly in its path. The commercial core was gone in a single afternoon. The sawmill, the hotels, the blacksmith shop, the general stores, all of it erased before anyone could do anything meaningful to stop it. The fire claimed 43 lives across the region and left over 11,000 settlers without shelter. What makes Milberta's story particularly haunting is the description survivors left behind of their lives before the fire. They spoke of fighting 7 months of blinding snow and 3 months of black flies to build something worth having. They built it, and then one October afternoon took it all back. The lone survivor is the historic Milberta United Church, standing isolated among agricultural fields, recently decommissioned and facing an uncertain future. Fire erased Milberta in hours. The next town was strangled slowly by its own industry. Number 9. Balaclava, Ontario. This town produced one of the earliest environmental lawsuits in Ontario history, and nobody talks about it. Balaclava was built around a massive water-powered sawmill, established in Renfrew County in the 1850s, situated along Scotch Bush Road west of the town of Renfrew. At peak operation, it was a fully functioning lumber economy. The mill, a blacksmith shop, a general store, farms on the periphery, and a community built on the premise that the old-growth forests of eastern Ontario would last forever. They did not. And as the timber thinned, the decisions made inside that mill started creating problems downstream, literally. In 1911, the Richards family, who operated the mill, were sued by a downstream gristmill operator for dumping immense quantities of sawdust directly into the local river, choking the waterway and destroying the gristmill's operations. The gristmill won. The court ordered the installation of Ontario's first ever specialized iron sawdust burner, one of the earliest environmental pollution rulings in provincial history. It was not enough to save the town. Deforestation eliminated the resource base. The regional railway network expanded and bypassed Balaclava entirely. The mill ran in a diminished capacity until 1967. The general store held on until the mid-1970s, then silence. The sawmill shell and the old sawdust burner still stand today, rotting slowly on private property off Scotch Bush Road. Balaclava lost its industry. The next town lost its rail line and its forest at the same time. Number 8. Swords, Ontario. There is a schoolhouse in the Parry Sound backwoods that has been sitting empty since before most of its students' grandchildren were born. Swords was established in 1894 as a rail and lumber outpost deep in the Muskoka-Parry Sound corridor, along what was then the Ottawa, Arnprior, and Parry Sound railway line. The settlement existed because of two things, the railway and the white pine forest. When the community acquired the name Swords in 1925, taken from the family that came to control much of its operations, it had a hotel, a general store, school, and the quiet confidence of a place that expected to grow. Both pillars collapsed together. The white pine forests of the surrounding region were clear-cut into commercial oblivion. The railway that once made the town accessible became economically non-viable. The post-war years saw the younger generation leave for cities, and nobody came back. The original 1904 wood-plank schoolhouse still stands, stabilized into use as a local community gathering space, which is remarkable. The Maple Lake Hotel building is deteriorating. The general store is structurally compromised by decades of exposure and break-ins. The old railway bed is now a recreational trail, so you can walk right through where the town used to be. From the backwoods of Parry Sound, the next entry takes a sharp turn into a place that was preserved almost perfectly, and somehow that makes it worse. Stop for a moment and notice what these 8 towns have in common. Not age, not location, not even cause. What connects them is speed. How fast the wilderness moves to erase human ambition the moment the economic reason for a place disappears. These structures were built for immediate return, not permanence. And the forest, the rock, and the river are extraordinarily patient. The next entries are different. These were not accidents of economics. These were decisions. Number 7. Cooper's Falls, Ontario. The buildings are still standing. That is almost the most unsettling part. Thomas Cooper established this logging and milling hamlet in 1864 around the treacherous falls of the Black River in Ramara Township, northeast of Orillia. The community grew around the river's power, the falls drove the mill drove the economy, and the economy kept people close enough together to build a church and a school and call it home. When the Black River lumber drives collapsed in the early 20th century, the younger residents left for manufacturing jobs in Orillia and Toronto. They left one by one. Over decades, the structures stayed. That is what makes Coopers Falls different from most of the ruins in this video. The Coopers Falls General Store stands along Coopers Falls Road, still recognizable, its exterior intact. The Methodist Church is still there. Log residences still line the roadside. From a car window, you could almost convince yourself that someone just stepped out for a moment and would be back shortly. Nobody is coming back. The interior floors are soft now. The framing is decaying from the inside out. The buildings are standing, but they are standing the way a person stands when they are only barely still upright, a ghost that refuses to fall. The next location is the opposite, an institution buried so deep in the wilderness it barely registers that it existed at all. Number 6. Herons Mills, Ontario. Hidden on private property in the Lanark Highlands is a dry stone bridge that a river has been flowing under continuously since the 1840s. The milling complex along the Clyde River in Lanark County began as Gould's Mills in 1840, passed to the Heron family in 1871, and operated as a water-powered timber and grist milling village for nearly a century before the post-Second World War centralization of milling operations killed it. The shift was not dramatic. Large-scale, electrically driven urban processors simply undercut every small rural mill in eastern Ontario until none of them were commercially viable anymore. What remained was left standing. The dry stone bridge across the Clyde River is fully intact. Centuries of spring floods have not moved it. The main timber mill ruins, missing their roof, missing one wall, still contain the original interior machinery gears, rusting in place as though someone walked away mid-shift and never came back. The Gillies family homestead log house stands on the property. All of it sits on private land, visible from the public road right-of-way off Heron Mills Road. The craftsmanship in those stone walls is extraordinary. The kind of work that makes the machines that replaced it feel like an insult. From pioneer stonework to Cold War concrete. The next location is in a different century entirely. Number 5. Foymount, Ontario. Ontario's highest inhabited point once pointed radar dishes at the Soviet Union. Foymount was built in 1950 atop the Bonachir Caves escarpment in Renfrew County, 523 meters above sea level, as part of Canada's Pine Tree Line, a continental radar system designed to detect incoming Soviet nuclear bombers before they reached populated Canadian cities. The base was operational by 1952, staffed by RCAF personnel and the civilian workers who kept the systems running. By 1974, it was obsolete. Satellite tracking technology and automated distant early warning systems had made the entire Pine Tree Line redundant. The base was shuttered without ceremony. 90 stable civilian jobs disappeared overnight. A $2 million annual payroll evaporated from a rural county that had no replacement for it. The local municipality spent decades in near bankruptcy trying to recover. What is left on that mountaintop is surreal. Massive windowless concrete radar tower bases squat against the sky, derelict barracks, steel frame structures, rows of identical military married quarters housing, the PMQs, where families once lived ordinary lives at an extraordinary altitude. In July of 1996, the CBC transformed these ruins into a war-torn Bosnian village for a television drama, finding it cheaper and easier than filming in Europe. The concrete had the right vocabulary for devastation. From Cold War paranoia, the next entry drops into something far more human, a town frozen not by technology but by a single government decision. Number 4. Brougham, Ontario. On March 2, 1972, the federal government told 6,500 people that their homes belonged to an airport now. Brougham was a thriving agricultural hub at the intersection of Highway 7 and Brock Road in what is now the city of Pickering, a genuine small-town civic center with an 1853 Italianate heritage home known as the Bentley House, a wood-framed 1854 town hall, an 1859 brick schoolhouse, and an 1880 temperance hall. These were not rough frontier structures. They were permanent buildings built by people who expected to stay. Then the government of Pierre Trudeau expropriated 18,000 acres of prime agricultural land to build a massive new international airport meant to replace Malton. The displacement was immediate and total. Families who had farmed the same land for generations were given official notice and removed. The community that formed in response, People Over Plains, used the 1854 Pickering Town Hall as their legal battleground and fought back hard enough that the airport project stalled entirely and has never been built, which means Brougham exists in a state of permanent institutional suspension. The Bentley House is boarded up, the town hall is boarded up. Dozens of mid-century ranch houses sit sealed and maintained at bare minimum structural standard by the federal government, held in place by a project that never happened, unable to become anything else. The next entry involves a different kind of institutional confinement, one with iron bars. Number 3. Camp Bison and the Burwash Industrial Farm, Ontario. The man who would go on to front one of the most successful rock bands in the world spent time locked inside this place, and later said it nearly broke him. Burwash Industrial Farm opened in 1914 south of Sudbury as a sprawling, self-sufficient agricultural prison, 35,000 acres of wilderness, where low-risk offenders serving sentences of less than 2 years were put to work farming the land. At its peak, roughly 1,000 residents and 800 inmates occupied the site. It was its own ecosystem, its own economy, its own social structure, its own permanent population living in a kind of forced rural suspension. David Clayton Thomas, who became the lead vocalist of Blood, Sweat, and Tears, documented his time at Burwash in his autobiography. He described the psychological isolation as severe and deliberate, enforced by the sheer remoteness of the location as much as by institutional policy. The distance from anything resembling ordinary life was itself the punishment. In July of 1974, Ontario's Minister of Correctional Services announced the closure. Operational costs had become impossible to justify. The remaining population was dispersed. The residential staff town site was partially demolished in the 1990s. But the monumental multi-story red brick main prison complex, Camp Bison, was left standing. Today, the rusted iron bars of the cell blocks are still inside. The corridors are covered in graffiti and decades of accumulated darkness. An institutional cemetery sits in the surrounding wilderness. Access requires a 4.5-kilometer hike. Some people make the trip. 2 entries remain. Both involve towns that were not abandoned, they were drowned. Number 2. Moulinette, Ontario, one of the lost villages. In the summer of 1958, the St. Lawrence River swallowed 10 Ontario towns whole. Moulinette was a pioneer-era industrial hub settled in the late 18th century along the St. Lawrence River near what is now Cornwall in South Stormont Township. It had operated for over a century and a half by the time the Moses Saunders Power Dam closed on July 1, 1958, permanently flooding the river valley to allow deep-draft ocean cargo vessels to travel inland as part of the St. Lawrence Seaway and Power Project. The flooding of the lost villages displaced over 6,500 residents. Roughly 530 homes were physically uprooted by massive machines and relocated to newly planned towns called Long Saw and Ingleside. Sterile corporate places with none of the accumulated character of what had been lost. Historic brick churches were dismantled or burned in controlled demolitions before the water rose. Moulinette's foundations, the remnants of the Mille Roche powerhouse, the old water locks, and the flooded asphalt roads all sit intact beneath the cold, fresh water of Lake St. Lawrence. Scuba divers access them from the shores of the Long Saw Parkway. The invasive zebra mussels have encrusted everything now, a kind of second colonization of a place that never had a chance to resist the first. The final entry is the largest of the lost villages, and what happened there just before the water rose is something you will not forget. Number 1. Aultsville, Ontario, and the submerged Highway 2. Before the water rose, the Canadian government set the town on fire, on purpose, while the families who had lived there watched. Aultsville was founded in 1787 by United Empire Loyalists along the St. Lawrence River, one of the oldest English-speaking communities in the province. By the time the Seaway project came along in the 1950s, it had a ferry terminal, schools, factories, and over a century and a half of lived human history embedded in its foundations. It was also the site of something that does not appear in the standard histories of the Seaway. When the residents of Aultsville were displaced and the town was evacuated in advance of the July 1958 flooding, The Canadian government allowed scientists to use the abandoned homes as a live testing laboratory. Researchers systematically set multiple historic structures on fire, measuring the speed at which fire spread from building to building under controlled conditions. This was called the controlled destruction experiment. The displaced families, people who had lived in those houses, who had been born in those rooms, watched their ancestral hometown burn to the ground from a distance before the river finished what the fire started. The largest and most economically significant of the lost villages, Aultsville now sits beneath Lake St. Lawrence off the shores of Ault Park near Long Saul. Scuba divers can follow the yellow center lines of Old Highway 2 down through the water column, past stone cellars and intact concrete sidewalks, past the structural footprint of the Aultsville train station. The road is still there. The town is still mapped just below the surface. The government needed a shipping lane. Aultsville was in the way. Ontario is shaped as much by what has been erased as by what has been built. These 13 places are not anomalies. They are the honest record of how communities actually end, not through failure necessarily, but through forces that communities have almost no power to resist. A geological survey that lied, a railway that bypassed the wrong road, a government that needed the land for something it considered more important than the people already living on it. What is remarkable is not that these places were lost. What is remarkable is that traces of them survive at all. In the warping boards of a general store along a quiet intersection, in the gears of a mill that stopped turning before most of us were alive, in the submerged road lines of a town that families drove through on ordinary Tuesday afternoons. These were real communities. Real people built them, and real people lost them. That distinction matters even now, even when the buildings are nearly gone. If your family was connected to any of these places, especially the lost villages, share it in the comments. And if there are Ontario ghost towns that belong on this list, name them. The province has more buried history than most people realize.